The world was supposed to end, not because of politicians, not because of generals, but because of 3 men in a metal tube 200 meters underground. 2 said, "Let's launch." The third said, "No," and humanity continued to exist. Black Saturday, October 27th, 1962. Washington does not look like a city on the edge of nuclear war. The sun rises clean over the Potomac. Traffic moves. Reporters gather outside the White House, sensing history but not its temperature. Inside the executive committee room, the air is tight. President John F. Kennedy sits at the head of the table, jacket off, sleeves slightly rolled, listening as voices overlap in controlled tension. Intelligence updates are delivered in clipped sentences. Soviet missile sites in Cuba are nearing operational readiness. A U-2 has been shot down. Another has drifted over Soviet airspace by mistake. The margin for error is collapsing. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara outlines naval operations. The quarantine line is holding. U.S. destroyers have established contact with a submerged submarine. Identification is unconfirmed but assessed as Soviet. Kennedy asks a quiet question. "What are the instructions?" "Signal depth charges." McNamara replies, "Practice-sized, non-lethal, designed to force surfacing." The word non-lethal hangs in the air. It is a technical reassurance, not a guarantee. Across the Atlantic, in Moscow, the atmosphere is different, but no less strained. Nikita Khrushchev stands over a large naval chart, surrounded by advisors and military officers. Messages from Washington have arrived in 2 conflicting tones, one conciliatory, one firm. Time zones distort the rhythm of diplomacy. Hours feel longer in transit. Khrushchev speaks sharply. "The Americans are testing us. They believe we will retreat." An admiral explains the submarine deployments near Cuba. Communications are limited. Radio silence has been ordered for operational security. Once submerged, the boats operate with incomplete information. Khrushchev nods slowly. "They must avoid provocation," he says. He does not say what happens if provocation finds them first. The Kremlin room falls quiet. Every man present understands that submarine commanders are isolated decision-makers. Orders sent days earlier may not match the conditions unfolding now. The camera of history drops beneath the surface. The Atlantic closes overhead like a lid. Soviet submarine B-59 moves at 60 meters below the surface, running on battery power. Depth, 60 meters. Battery, 82%. Surface contacts, 4 American warships. Inside the hull, the temperature is oppressive. Ventilation is minimal. The boat has been submerged longer than planned. Carbon dioxide levels creep upward. Diesel fumes linger from earlier snorkeling operations, clinging to clothing and skin. Red emergency lighting fills the compartments, conserving power but distorting faces into sharp shadows. Sweat runs down necks and collects at collars. Condensation beads along pipes and drips steadily onto metal decking. Sonar operators work in near silence. Multiple screws. One reports softly, maintaining position above us. Captain Valentin Savitsky stands rigid in the control room. His uniform is damp at the collar. His expression reveals fatigue, layered beneath discipline. Beside and slightly behind him stands Vasily Arkhipov, flotilla chief of staff, aboard the vessel. He does not dominate the space. He observes. His presence carries authority, but he speaks little. His mission is implicit: ensure that no irreversible action is taken in error. Above them, U.S. Navy destroyers follow procedure. Small practice depth charges, explosive signals, are prepared for release. Their purpose is to compel the submarine to surface without causing structural damage. On B-59, no one hears the word signal. The first explosion arrives as a blunt shockwave. The hull trembles. Loose droplets of condensation fall in unison from overhead piping. Men glance at one another. No one speaks immediately. A second detonation follows, closer. The pressure wave compresses the air inside the control room. Instruments rattle. A wrench slips from a tray and strikes the deck with a metallic crack. They are dropping charges, an officer says quietly. Savitsky's jaw tightens. Battle stations, he orders, voice controlled but edged. The submarine's internal noise increases, valves adjusting, systems responding. Every mechanical sound feels amplified in confined steel space. Another explosion. Stronger. The red lights flicker once, then stabilize. Arkhipov remains still, eyes moving between gauges. The captain and the sonar reports. He understands the isolation. Communications from Moscow are outdated. Radio silence and battery limitations prevent clarification. The crew has no confirmation that war has not already begun above them. From the American perspective, this is controlled escalation. From inside B-59, it is indistinguishable from attack. The temperature climbs further. Air feels dense. Sweat stings eyes. The smell of oil and human breath thickens with every minute. Contact holding. Sonar reports. They are circling. Another blast reverberates through the hull, heavier than the previous ones. The deck plates vibrate violently. A gauge needle jumps, then settles. Savitsky's face hardens. His voice carries sharper authority now. They want us up. No one answers. Surfacing means exposure, possible capture, humiliation before the world. Remaining submerged risks damage, suffocation, miscalculation. Above, American ships maintain pattern. Below, men measure their reality by concussion and vibration. Then it happens. A significantly stronger explosion tears through the surrounding water. The impact is close enough that the hull groans audibly. Lights dim for a fraction of a second. A metallic clang echoes from somewhere forward. For one suspended moment, no one breathes. This blast does not feel procedural. It feels like escalation. In the red glow of emergency lighting, amid dripping condensation and thickening air, the officers of B-59 exchange brief, unreadable looks. Is this still a warning? Or has Black Saturday crossed the line into war? No one on board can answer, and no one above knows what question has just been forced upon them. 6 hours underwater. No confirmed signal from Moscow. Depth remains steady. The hull holds. The ocean presses from all sides. Time underwater. 6 hours. Temperature inside. 38 degrees Celsius battery. 64% CO2 levels. Rising surface contacts. 6 American ships. The radio room is silent except for static. Attempts to raise higher command have failed. Transmission windows were brief and uncertain, even before the American ships established contact. Now interference and operational constraints make reception unreliable. The last authenticated instruction is hours old. It contains no guidance for this exact scenario. Inside WWII, isolation becomes operational reality. The air has grown heavier. At 38 degrees Celsius, sweat no longer evaporates. It clings. Uniforms are soaked through. Men remove caps. Some work shirtless. Faces are flushed. Eyes blink more slowly. Carbon dioxide accumulates gradually but perceptibly. A faint headache begins behind the eyes of more than one crewman. Breathing feels slightly insufficient, as if oxygen has thinned by an invisible margin. Sonar reports increased activity above. 6 surface vessels, the operator confirms, maintaining position. Variable bearing shifts. They are coordinating. Captain Valentin Savitsky stands in the control compartment, jaw tight, eyes sharp despite fatigue. His world has narrowed to instruments, sound reports, and the vibration patterns of distant propellers. He calculates in silence. 6 American ships do not gather by accident. They do not drop charges for amusement. The depth charges continue intermittently, controlled, measured. But in a sealed steel hull without radio confirmation, intention cannot be verified. Savitsky considers the possibility he has not yet spoken aloud. Perhaps war has already begun. The Americans have nuclear superiority. They have bases in Turkey. They have public resolve. If Moscow has struck elsewhere, retaliation could be underway. Submarines would be priority targets. No communication. Explosions overhead. Increasing pressure. The logic forms in layers. He turns slightly. Status of main batteries. 64%. The engineer replies, "We cannot remain submerged indefinitely. At reduced battery levels, propulsion becomes limited. Surfacing under 6 American warships would mean immediate confrontation. Refusal to surface invites further escalation. In a compartment aft, secured under strict protocol, rests the weapon no one mentions casually. A single T-5 nuclear torpedo. Yield estimated at approximately 15 kilotons, comparable to the device used at Hiroshima. Effective blast radius roughly 10 kilometers. In confined waters, the pressure wave would be devastating. Any surface vessels within range would be destroyed or severely crippled. It is not a strategic weapon. It is tactical. But in October 1962, tactical nuclear use would not remain tactical. Savitsky knows the authorization procedure. Deployment requires agreement among 3 officers: the captain, the political officer, and the flotilla chief of staff aboard, Vasily Arkhipov. The torpedo is not armed by impulse. It requires preparation, coded components, procedural confirmation. Another explosion rolls through the water, heavier than previous ones. The hull shudders. A gauge flickers and steadies. A sailor grips a railing tighter than necessary. The temperature seems to climb another degree. Savitsky wipes sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. "They are forcing us," he says quietly. The political officer nods. It may already have started elsewhere. No one challenges the statement. No one can disprove it. Above them, 6 American ships adjust formation. Below, B-59 operates in informational darkness. Savitsky's internal calculation shifts from avoidance to contingency. If this is war, survival depends on immediate decisive action. If this is not war, action may create it. He turns to the weapons officer. "Prepare the special weapon." The words are precise, not emotional, not shouted. Several men freeze for half a second before movement resumes. The procedures begin. Authentication checks, unlocking mechanisms, technical inspections. The torpedo compartment becomes the center of gravity aboard the submarine. In the control room, Arkhipov remains silent, observing. His expression reveals nothing. He watches Savitsky, then the instruments, then the men moving toward the torpedo bay. Battery, 64%. CO2 continues to rise. 6 ships above. Another distant detonation. The preparation advances step by step, but the final authorization has not yet been given. Inside the steel hull of B-59, the machinery of nuclear release has begun to turn, while the decision itself still hangs, suspended in overheated air. 12 hours underwater. Time submerged. 12 hours internal temperature. 45 degrees Celsius battery. 41% CO2 concentration. Critical rise. Surface contacts. 9 American ships. The submarine no longer feels like a vessel. It feels like a sealed engine room. At 45 degrees Celsius, the air burns the lungs. Sweat no longer cools. It saturates clothing completely. The metal bulkheads radiate trapped heat, Back into the compartments. Condensation mixes with perspiration, dripping steadily onto control panels and deck plates. The men move slower now. Speech becomes shorter. Breathing grows labored. Carbon dioxide levels climb high enough that concentration falters. A sonar operator rubs his eyes repeatedly, as if clearing fog from glass. An engineer leans against a bulkhead longer than necessary before returning to his post. One sailor collapses briefly near the forward compartment. He regains consciousness within seconds, disoriented, insisting he is fine. Another begins muttering that he hears aircraft engines, though they are 60 meters below the surface. Hallucinations do not announce themselves as such. They begin as distortions, imagined sounds, moving shadows, misplaced confidence. Above, 9 American warships now circle in coordinated patterns, 9 propeller signatures, 9 hulls projecting authority downward. Each additional ship amplifies perception. To Savitsky, it looks less like signaling and more like containment before destruction. Another depth charge detonates. The hull reverberates violently. A gauge needle spikes and settles. The red lighting flickers but holds. Savitsky grips the edge of a console. His uniform is completely soaked. His breathing is heavy but controlled. He turns to the political officer and to Arkhipov. If they are attacking, Savitsky says, voice hoarse but firm, we respond. There is no shouting, only compression. Arkhipov finally steps forward, no longer silent. We do not have confirmation of war, he says evenly. The words cut through the compartment more sharply than the explosions. Savitsky's eyes narrow. Look around you, he replies. 9 ships, depth charges, radio silence. What more confirmation do you require? Arkhipov does not raise his voice. Confirmation from Moscow, he says, or a lethal strike. We have neither. Another sailor stumbles past them, steadying himself against a pipe. The physical deterioration of the crew is no longer subtle. Battery power continues to drain, 41%. At this level, endurance is limited. Extended submergence risks full depletion, leaving the submarine unable to maneuver effectively. The weapons officer reports from aft that the special torpedo has been brought to readiness, Phase 1. Safeties remain engaged. Final arming procedures await command authorization. Savitsky's face tightens. If they force us to the surface, he says, we are captured. If they destroy us here, we die without response. If this is war, history will not forgive hesitation. Arkhipav's reply is controlled, analytical despite the suffocating heat. If this is not war, he says, history will not forgive us for starting one. The compartment grows silent except for machinery and distant propellers. The political officer looks between them. Sweat drips from his chin onto the deck. Another explosion strikes closer than the last. The hull groans deeply, metal flexing under pressure. Several men flinch visibly. Savitsky straightens. We cannot remain passive. Arkhipov holds his gaze. We cannot act without certainty. The procedure for launch requires agreement of 3 senior officers aboard. Savitsky has given verbal intent. The political officer inhales slowly, then nods toward the captain. I agree with the commander, he says. The words land heavily. 2 authorizations. Only 1 remains. All eyes turn, almost involuntarily, toward Arkhipov. Battery, 41%. Temperature, 45 degrees Celsius. CO2, climbing. 9 American ships overhead. The torpedo rests in its tube, capable of destroying every vessel above within a 10-kilometer radius. Preparation is complete. Only the final confirmation was missing. 15 hours underwater. Time submerged. 15 hours. Battery, 28%. CO2, Critical surface contacts. 9 American ships. The submarine has entered a zone where mechanical limits and human limits converge. At 28% battery, propulsion margins narrow sharply. Every adjustment of course costs endurance. Every additional minute submerged reduces options. The engineers no longer speak in projections measured in hours. They speak in fractions. CO2 levels have crossed into critical range. Headaches are constant now. Breathing feels shallow even when lungs are full. 2 sailors have been relieved after collapsing briefly at their stations. One insists he sees daylight through the hull. Another laughs once without context, then stops abruptly when no one joins him. The heat has stabilized only because it cannot rise much further. 45 degrees remains constant, oppressive. Sweat pools in boots. Hands slip on metal controls. In the torpedo compartment, the T-5 nuclear weapon rests secured in its tube. Yield, approximately 15 kilotons. Effective destructive radius, near 10 kilometers. Arming requires more than technical preparation. It requires consensus. Soviet protocol for nuclear release aboard this submarine demands unanimous agreement from 3 officers. The commanding officer, Captain Valentin Savitsky, the political officer, and the flotilla chief of staff present aboard, Vasily Arkhipov. Without all 3, the weapon does not fire. Inside the control room, the moment approaches formal decision. The political officer stands rigid, face pale beneath sweat. Savitsky's breathing is heavy but steady. Arkhipov remains upright, though fatigue shows at the edges of his composure. Another distant explosion rolls through the water, less intense than earlier ones, but close enough to vibrate the hull. Savitsky speaks first. We will proceed to authorization. His tone is flat, procedural. The political officer nods immediately. I support launch, he says. His voice cracks slightly, but does not waver in meaning. Savitsky follows without hesitation. I support launch. 2 votes. Silence fills the compartment, heavier than the heat. 15 hours underwater, battery at 28%, CO2 critical. 9 American warships above, circling like mechanical predators. Every man in the compartment understands the implication. The torpedo has been prepared. Electrical systems are aligned. Final safeties remain in place only because procedure demands one remaining voice. All eyes turn toward Arkhipov. The pause stretches. It is not dramatic. It is suffocating. A drop of condensation falls from an overhead pipe and strikes the deck with an audible tick. Somewhere aft, machinery hums unevenly. Arkhipov inhales slowly. His head throbs. His uniform is soaked. The air tastes metallic. He speaks carefully. We do not have confirmation of nuclear exchange, he says. We do not have orders to initiate. We have depth charges that may be signaling. Savitsky's jaw tightens. They are driving us to the surface. Arkhipov nods once. Then we surface. The suggestion lands like an unexpected shockwave. Surface, under 9 American ships, means exposure, interrogation, potential capture. It means humiliation before both superpowers. It means surviving without firing. Savitsky's eyes narrow, and if they open fire when we surface, then we will know. Arkhipov replies evenly. Until then, we do not know. Another explosion detonates suddenly, closer, sharper than the previous few. The hull shudders violently. Lights flicker. A panel sparks briefly before stabilizing. Several crewmen instinctively crouch. The interruption fractures the moment. Savitsky turns toward the sound, then back toward Arkhipov. His face has shifted from deliberation to urgency. We cannot debate while they tighten the circle, he says. Battery, 28%. CO2, critical, 15 hours submerged. The engineer steps forward quietly. At current consumption, Commander, sustained submergence is no longer viable. The numbers press as hard as the ocean. Savitsky makes a decision, not final authorization, but operational continuation. Continue launch preparation, he orders. Final authorization pending. The weapons officer nods sharply and disappears toward the torpedo compartment. The machinery resumes its quiet sequence. Electrical checks, circuit confirmations, mechanical alignment. The vote remains incomplete. The weapon remains unfired, but the process moves forward, regardless. And inside, B-59, under crushing heat and rising carbon dioxide, the space for hesitation grows thinner with every passing minute. Battery, 18%. CO2, critical. Surface contacts, 11 American warships. 17 hours have nearly passed since B-59 lost reliable communication with Moscow. The submarine no longer feels like a combat platform. It feels like a furnace sealed in steel. Men breathe in shallow pulls. Faces are pale beneath sweat. One sailor is being held upright at his station because sitting risks unconsciousness. Another vomits quietly into a rag and returns to duty. Above them, 11 American ships now hold position. 11 propeller signatures on sonar, 11 hulls. The pattern has tightened. In the control room, the final argument begins, not shouted, not theatrical, but edged with exhaustion and consequence. Savitsky stands rigid, voice strained but controlled. They continue to attack us. Arkhipov answers immediately. They are not lethal strikes. Another depth charge rolls through the water, strong enough to rattle loose a cascade of droplets from overhead pipes. Savitsky gestures sharply toward the hull. That is an attack. Arkhipov does not step back. It is signaling, he says. If they intended destruction, we would already be destroyed. The political officer watches silently now. His earlier certainty has thinned under the accumulating pressure. Battery, 18%. At this level, maneuverability is dangerously limited. A prolonged standoff is not sustainable. Savitsky's breathing becomes heavier. We have no contact with Moscow, he says. No confirmation, no guidance. We are blind. Yes, Arkhipov replies, and because we are blind, we do not fire. The words land sharply. Savitsky's expression shifts. The logic he has held to this point, deterrence, survival, retaliation, begins to fracture under humiliation and fear. They force us to the surface like criminals, he says. We will not be disgraced before them. This is no longer pure calculation. It is pride, layered atop duty. Arkhipov sees the change. There is no disgrace in surviving, he answers evenly. There is no honor in starting a war we cannot confirm has begun. Another explosion detonates, closer, louder. The hull groans deeply. Lights flicker and recover. The engineer reports in a strained voice, CO2 at critical threshold. Several crewmen are now seated against bulkheads, semi-conscious but responsive. The torpedo compartment confirms readiness. Final safeties can be disengaged within seconds of authorization. Savitsky steps toward the weapons console. If they are attacking, he says, we answer. That is our duty. Arkhipov moves, not abruptly, not dramatically. He steps physically between the captain and the final authorization sequence. The motion is deliberate. The compartment falls silent except for the hum of systems and the distant churn of American propellers. Savitsky stares at him. You will stand in my way. Arkhipov holds his gaze. Yes. The air feels thinner still. We do not have confirmation of nuclear war, Arkhipov says, voice steady despite the heat and exhaustion. We do not have lethal damage. Moscow is silent. That means command still exists. If nuclear war had begun, we would know. Savitsky's eyes burn with frustration. They are pushing us to death, or to the surface. Arkhipov replies, those are not the same outcome. A long second passes, then another. Battery, 18%. 11 American ships. Critical CO2. Arkhipov speaks one final sentence. I do not authorize launch. The words are not loud, but they stop the process. In the torpedo compartment, technicians freeze in place, awaiting resolution. In the control room, the captain stands inches away from the man preventing nuclear detonation. Savitsky's authority aboard the vessel is absolute in most matters. But nuclear release requires unanimity. He could attempt to overrule through command pressure. He could attempt to reinterpret procedure. He could attempt to frame the situation as confirmed war. The question hangs in overheated air. Can the captain bypass him? Outside the hull, another explosion reverberates. Inside, two officers hold eye contact while history waits. If you feel the weight of this moment, one decision standing between escalation and restraint, take a second to support the channel. Like the video and subscribe, so more untold Cold War decisions like this can be brought into the light. The submarine remains submerged. The torpedo remains unfired, but authority and survival are now in direct collision. Battery, 9%. CO2, beyond recommended limits. Surface contacts, 11 American ships, 17 hours and counting beneath the Atlantic. The argument has ended, not in victory, not in concession, but in exhaustion and recognition. Captain Valentin Savitsky stands motionless for several seconds after Arkhipov's refusal. The torpedo remains armed but not authorized. The crew waits in suspended uncertainty. The engineer speaks quietly, voice raw. Comrade Captain, battery at 9%. We cannot maintain submerged propulsion much longer. 9% is not strategy. It is countdown. Savitsky inhales slowly. His pride, his anger, his sense of encirclement, all remain, but numbers now override emotion. He turns to Arkhipov. We surface, he says. The words are controlled, formal, final. No one cheers, no one relaxes. Surfacing under 11 American warships is not relief. It is exposure. Orders move through the compartments. Prepare to ascend. Ballast calculations are made. Systems shift. Men grip rails as adjustments begin. The submarine tilts slightly. Depth indicator, 200 meters. The climb begins. Each meter upward feels irreversible. The hull creaks under changing pressure gradients. Internal systems hum unevenly at low battery output, 150 meters. The air is no cleaner, the temperature no lower. But tension changes form. Submerged, they were unseen but hunted. On the surface, they will be visible and vulnerable. Battery, 9%. If propulsion fails mid-ascent, control becomes unpredictable. Engineers monitor every gauge with narrowed eyes. 100 meters. Sweat drips steadily onto instrument panels. One sailor whispers something that might be a prayer. Another stares at the depth gauge, as if willing it to move faster. No more explosions. The American ships have ceased depth charges. Above, sonar operators aboard U.S. destroyers note the submarine's change in depth. Orders are transmitted across decks. Searchlights prepare. 75 meters. The hull groans again, not from impact, but from pressure shift. Metal flexes in protest. 50 meters. Light begins to filter faintly through periscope optics. The world above is no longer abstract. Savitsky stands at the center of the control room. Expression hardened but composed. Maintain discipline, he says quietly. Arkhipov says nothing. He watches the gauges, then the captain, then the men around him. The decision has been made. Now they must live with its consequences. 30 meters. Ballast tanks adjust again. The submarine rises with deliberate slowness. 10 meters. The ocean above feels thin now, almost fragile. Then, the hull breaks the surface. Water cascades off steel plating. Air rushes across the exterior. Hatches remain closed for several seconds while systems stabilize. On deck above, American warships illuminate the surfaced submarine with powerful searchlights. White beams cut across the Atlantic dusk, converging on B-59. 11 ships, guns trained, radars locked, but no one fires. Inside the submarine, the sudden shift from red emergency lighting to faint natural light, filtering through periscope optics, feels unreal. Savitsky orders the hatch opened. Fresh air floods downward, humid but breathable. Crewmen inhale deeply, some coughing as their lungs adjust. Several stagger slightly from sudden oxygen. On deck, Soviet sailors emerge cautiously under blinding beams of American light. The Atlantic wind cools sweat-soaked uniforms. Across the water, American sailors watch through binoculars. Orders are clear. Observe, compel, avoid escalation. No shots, no missiles, no torpedoes, just light. Inside the control room, Arkhipov closes his eyes briefly, not in triumph, but in recalibration. Battery, 9%. CO2 levels slowly begin to fall as ventilation improves. The nuclear torpedo remains unused. Then, in the radio compartment, a signal is detected. Faint, fragmented, but unmistakably authenticated. Message from Moscow. The radio man calls out. All movement stops. Savitsky turns slowly. Decoded? Partial. The operator replies. Content still processing. The room tightens again, not with heat, but with anticipation. The submarine floats under American searchlights. The war has not begun, but Moscow is speaking, and no one yet knows what it will say. The message from Moscow, once fully decoded, contained no authorization for war. It carried no confirmation of nuclear exchange, no order to retaliate, no indication that hostilities had begun elsewhere. The crisis, at that moment, still lived in diplomacy. Above B-59, the 11 American warships had not been preparing for destruction. The depth charges dropped through the Atlantic were practice signals, designed to force surfacing, not to rupture hulls. They were calibrated to intimidate, not to kill. Inside the submarine, that distinction had never been clear. Black Saturday passed without nuclear fire. In Washington, President Kennedy continued negotiations through back channels. In Moscow, Nikita Khrushchev searched for an exit that preserved deterrence without triggering catastrophe. Within days, an agreement would emerge. Soviet missiles withdrawn from Cuba, American missiles quietly removed from Turkey. The world would step back. But on B-59, there would be no ceremony. No medal presentation on deck. No public acknowledgement that a nuclear torpedo had come within a single, dissenting voice of launch. The submarine returned to port under orders. Debriefings were conducted. Reports were written in controlled language. Operational procedures were reviewed. The event was classified. Silence became policy. Captain Valentin Savitsky continued his naval career. He was neither court-martialed nor celebrated. His decision to surface could be interpreted as prudence or as submission. The official record did not dwell on interpretation. Vasily Arkhipov did not speak publicly about that night. He resumed duty. He trained officers. He carried on as a professional sailor in a system that valued discipline more than individual restraint. The nuclear torpedo remained a footnote in classified documentation. For decades, the details of October 27, 1962, beneath the Atlantic, were unknown outside a narrow circle of analysts and naval officers. The archives remained sealed. The public narrative of the Cuban Missile Crisis centered on speeches, letters, and summit decisions, not on overheated compartments 60 meters below the surface. History often preserves what is visible. It rarely records what almost happened. Years later, artifacts from that era would be displayed behind museum glass. A Soviet naval officer's uniform, dark fabric, brass buttons dulled by time, rank insignia precise and formal. Visitors would walk past it in climate-controlled silence. There would be no red emergency lighting, no condensation dripping from pipes, no CO2 warnings, no depth gauge climbing from 200 to 50 meters. Just fabric, thread, metal, a still object representing a moment that nearly moved the world. There was no medal pinned to that uniform for refusing to fire, no citation that read, "Prevented nuclear exchange," no public recognition ceremony attended by heads of state. The survival of millions does not always generate applause. It sometimes leaves only paperwork. On that October day, the difference between war and restraint was not a technological failure, nor an intercepted signal, nor a last-minute diplomatic cable. It was a procedural requirement for unanimous agreement, and one officer who chose not to give it. The submarine surfaced. The torpedo remained unfired. The American ships did not shoot. The crisis de-escalated. The world continued. In later years, when documents slowly emerged and historians reconstructed the sequence, the realization was unsettling in its simplicity. The survival of cities, of continents, of generations not yet born, had rested in part on a refusal, not the pressing of a button, the refusal to press it. There is no monument in the Atlantic marking the approximate coordinates of B-59 that night. The ocean does not remember near misses, it closes over them. But the lesson remains. In systems built for retaliation, restraint can be the most decisive act. Black Saturday did not end with fire. It ended with a submarine surfacing under blinding lights, and with a decision not to escalate uncertainty into annihilation. If this story changed how you see the Cold War, if it made you reconsider how close history came to another path, support the channel. Subscribe for more deeply researched stories where the outcome was never guaranteed. They'll like the video, so this moment reaches others. And in the comments, answer one question. If you had been in that control room, under 45 degrees of heat, with 11 enemy ships above, would you have waited for certainty or acted on fear? History remembers outcomes. It rarely remembers hesitation. But sometimes, hesitation is what saves the world.